This video was brought to you with the help of my lovely patrons.
In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none.
In 1946, the book The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, Patterns of Japanese Culture was published and penned by Ruth Benedict, a U.S. anthropologist who was tasked by the White House to do a study on Japanese culture. Her book was a culture at a distance study, in that U.S. anthropologists could not study Imperial Japan nor Nazi Germany in real time during the war, so they went afterwards to try to uncover and understand what they could. Her study was novel at the time, and I'd argue still today, despite it being understandably controversial due to the fact that it tries to sum up an entirety of a culture in one book, and was written at a time that was historically very unique to the world, and thus could never be a good summation of Japanese culture at large. American scholar C. Douglas Loomis has written criticisms of Benedict's book in that it represented the ideology of a class for that of the entire culture, a state of acute social dislocation for a normal condition, and an extraordinary moment in a nation's history as an unvarying norm of social behavior, essentially using wartime Japan as a barometer for Japanese culture and societal norms. The most memorable part of her study, and what brings us here today, is the chapter Dilemma of Virtue, in which she discusses the idea of a shame versus guilt society. She describes the Japanese living under a shame society and the US under a guilty one. She writes on page 222, "In Japan, one cultivates self-respect, they say, because of society. If there were no society, one would not need to respect oneself." These are extreme statements of an external sanction for self-respect. They are statements which take no account of internal sanctions for proper behavior. The Japanese sometimes react as strongly as any Puritan to a private accumulation of guilt, but their extreme statements nevertheless point out correctly where the emphasis falls in Japan. It falls on the importance of shame rather than on the importance of guilt. In anthropological studies of different cultures, the distinction between those which rely heavily on shame and those that rely heavily on guilt are an important one. A society that inculcates absolute standards of morality and relies on men's developing a conscience is a guilty culture by definition. Keep a pin in this for later. But a man in such a society may, as in the US, suffer in addition from shame when he accuses himself of gaucheries which are in no way sins. He may be exceedingly chagrined about not dressing appropriately for the occasion or about a slip of the tongue. In a culture where shame is a major sanction, people are chagrined about acts which we expect people to feel guilty about. This chagrin can be very intense, and it cannot be relieved, as guilt can be, by confession and atonement. A man who has sinned can get relief by unburdening himself. This device of confession is used in our secular therapy and by many religious groups which otherwise have little in common. Where shame is the major sanction, a man does not experience relief when he makes his fault public, even to a confessor. So long as his bad behavior does not get out into the world, he need not be troubled, and confession appears to him merely a way of courting trouble. Shame cultures therefore do not provide for confessions, even to the gods. They have ceremonies for good luck rather than expiation. In short, true shame cultures rely on external sanctions for good behavior, not, as true guilt cultures do, on an internalized conviction of sin. The Japanese man orients himself towards the verdict of others. Shame, they say, is the root of virtue. A man who is sensitive to it will carry out all the rules of a good man's behavior. A man who knows shame is sometimes translated to virtuous man, sometimes man of honor. Shame has the same place of authority in Japanese ethics that a clear conscience and being right with God and the avoidance of sin have in Western ethics. And though Benedict does say that the two aren't mutually exclusive, and we haven't even gotten into the culture of fear yet, which isn't mutually exclusive in this spectrum either, I think the main argument holds up. The US, in my opinion, is a culture based on puritanical guilt, and individual guilt is used in order to uphold social norms and larger systems. We live in a country where we're brought up to believe that people will do the right thing because otherwise they'll feel an internal sense of guilt and come forward and apologize. And though a noble sentiment to think everyone in society will grow a conscience and do the right thing, in practice it's a different story. Hence why we have the modern judicial system in the US that is supposed to work on the idea that you're innocent until proven guilty. We have supposed law and order to find guilty people, as with guilt, it's an individual internal struggle that must be discovered, not something that is readily apparent. And unfortunately, even the justice system that is in theory supposed to protect and work for the people, instead by design protects the ultra-wealthy and go after whoever they deem as unworthy, whether it be immigrants, black people, the poor and unhoused, and the LGBTQ+ community. In Benedict's book, the guilt culture is preferred by her in that, as she notes, there is no way to really relieve oneself of shame other than through punishment or a public shaming, or back in the day, a public execution. In shame culture, you are judged by your peers openly, and your shame needs to be reckoned with by society. It's not up to you as an individual to just feel bad and be punished by the law. That's not enough. And the idea that we might need to bring back public shaming makes a lot of people, especially Democrats and liberals, uncomfortable because that's just not what civilized modern societies filled with moderates do, even when their political opponents would gladly dance on their graves. Though, as Foucault writes, the first time the guillotine was used, the Chronique de Paris, and I don't speak French, reported that people complained that they could not see anything and chanted, "Give us back our gallows." But it's not something, let's say again, that modern civilized Western thinking countries like the US would take part in, at least not in 1946 when this book was published. Though France is one of those modern Western thinking countries, their politics are much more left-leaning compared to the US Democratic Party, and they have a proud history of violent revolution. Just look at their Olympic opening ceremony. And even recently as 2022, Dutch author Marcel H. van Herpen wrote that the US is at risk of becoming a shame society, insinuating that shame societies are not good. In his book, The Rise of the Shame Society, America's Change from a Guilt Culture into a Shame Culture, he weighs the arguments for and against the shame society and concludes that a guilt-centered approach remains preferable. And that's funny to me because if anything, I see a trend going in the other direction, at least in 2025, 3 years later. There's a popular meme of people wanting to bring back public shaming, of wanting to be able to shame others for their individual choices because many people in power in the US at least are both shameless and don't see themselves as guilty of any social transgression, or crime even, whether they're justifying school shootings or saying to get along with a deceased white supremacist. As professor of philosophy, Olufemi O. Taiwo wrote for the Boston Review in response to Ezra Klein's op-ed on white supremacist Charlie Kirk doing politics the right way, shame is essential. Shame serves as a robustly liberal alternative to the political violence that Klein and company rightly abhor. It is quite literally the least one can do to ensure rules of social conduct that upheld minimal levels of dignity for all involved. This is one valuable function of shame. It reminds us of who we want to be when we fall short, a goalpost that is necessarily anchored to the lofty height that our conduct fell beneath. We also encourage and defend these general social standards when we hold others to them, and not just ourselves. Because let's be real here, most of us aren't good at holding ourselves accountable. And with money and power in the mix, no one is willingly going to look in the mirror and give that up because they might feel a little guilty. What's more likely is that they feel no remorse because in their eyes and with their own moral compass, they still think they're in the right. Even after Ted Bundy was found guilty, it was hard to ever really tell if he felt that he was guilty, or that he even felt remorse. And what's worse still is that the public shaming that was supposed to happen turned into a fan frenzy of people actually wishing to get closer to him. People who commemorated his death were seen as wrong by the Conversations with the Killer Ted Bundy Netflix series. And though I agree that the state shouldn't be allowed to execute people, I don't know if it's right to say that people can't also revel in the death of someone who was a serial killer who reveled in the murder of others. What do you think? And the authoritarian leaders of today clearly don't feel guilt either for what they're bringing upon the most vulnerable. Most people don't want to wait for dictators to have a moral growth spurt. Shame is the more uncomfortable option. It hurts to be publicly scorned by our peers, but it might be the only way to combat fascist ideology and authoritarian leaders, whether they be politicians or tech billionaires. Though I'm slightly on the more cynical side that these types of people are just shameless. It's not even that they're shameless. Their peers, who should be holding them accountable, have no incentive to do so. Even though to feel shame, you don't need to be found legally guilty or feel morally so. Because one is shameless, how can they in turn feel shame? On the other hand, like Taiwo said, shaming is simply the liberal alternative to fighting back against hate. It's the least we can do. Public condemnation and holding others accountable. And therefore, we should be able to do it freely without fear. From what I can see, I think the masses, at least on the left, want to bring back public shaming to make those in power feel something. Because clearly they don't feel guilty for their beliefs or actions. I mean, we have a convicted felon as a president. How can guilt still be preferable? But Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, one of the leaders of the Pan-African movement and the Black Panther Party, already knew that in the 1960s, saying, "In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The U.S. has none. The white wealthy people in the U.S. and those in power do not have a conscience, therefore they cannot feel guilt." And now we're trying to shift that to shame. Let's see how that works. On the face of it, shame and guilt seem very similar, and both are used to uphold social and moral norms and in turn, what is seen as illegal and legal in the eyes of the law. Though it should be noted that something being illegal or legal doesn't make it moral or immoral, as many laws are made to protect the wealthy and hurt the masses, like vagrancy laws that make it illegal to be homeless, or the laws that barred gay people from getting married, for instance. But in reality, guilt and shame do have their differences. In the 2018 paper reconsidering the differences between shame and guilt published in the European Journal of Psychology, the authors wrote, "Shame implies perceived lack of power to meet the standards of one's ideal self, whereas guilt implies perceived power and willingness to be harmful, that is, to violate the standards of one's moral self. The main difference between guilt and shame is that one is an inward struggle and the other is an outward one. According to this distinction, shame is elicited by public faults and one's fear of others' negative evaluations, whereas guilt is a private feeling elicited by one's own negative self-evaluation. However, the researchers of this paper question this framework by saying that one can feel shame even when their societal or moral discretion is not known to the world. The public versus private distinction is not decisive, in that shame can be felt even privately, they write. We suggest that the disapproved person will not experience shame, and certainly not guilt, when their discretion is made public, but other possible feelings, such as fear of the consequences of the negative evaluation, disappointment and resentment for having received an undeserved evaluation, helplessness elicited by the perceived inability to modify others' judgment, or most notably, embarrassment, which implies no necessary negative self-evaluation. Embarrassment, they write, is a universal human phenomenon that can be used to modify people's behavior and actions, as when one even feels internal shame, that doesn't necessarily mean they'll change or feel guilty, but they will feel embarrassed if it comes out to the public. That's why whenever someone can embarrass Trump, for example, or he falls into an embarrassing situation, it makes headlines because maybe he doesn't feel shame or guilt, but maybe we can still take some power away by embarrassing him, even if it's just by happenstance like Escalator Gate. Or with Pedro Pascal calling JKR a loser. That's embarrassing, being called out like that. Or going back even further to Trump, the whole Kefevi thing. Though how much power is that really taking back? I don't know. What I do know is that though the two function similarly, and one can even feel shame without being publicly shamed, they are different in that to feel guilt you need to have some semblance of empathy or conscience, but to feel shame is a bit more complicated. Shame doesn't come by itself. It comes with other negative emotions like fear, resentment, helplessness, and can be much deeper than guilt, which can be washed away, at least in the US, with an apology or some form of atonement. So does that mean that it would work better to have shame as a consequence for transgressions such as inciting hate speech or a government coup or even something on a smaller scale like school bullying than having a guilty conscience or a guilty sentence? It's a big question that I don't have a simple answer for. Taiwo writes on the possibility of using shaming as a punishment for inciting hate against minorities and white supremacy that the point is that the possibility of overreach, as shame can run much deeper than guilt, is a price worth paying. Most of the alternatives involved either subjugation, combat, or both. Put another way, disrespect and denigration as beyond the pale as grounds for exclusion from polite company is turning the temperature down. Klein and others are helping to turn it up. Not to mention Kirk called empathy New Age BS, so why should we be empathetic in turn? Taiwo further notes we can admit that the feeling of shame can not only be constructive but also deeply corrosive when one internalizes shame or is prompted to the emotion by others' disapproval. But so too are some of the moral and personal failures that give rise to that disapproval. In some cases, these are poisonous enough to merit the harsh medicine of shame and shaming. If not during the rise of fascism, then when? In the end, using guilt as a main tactic to control people's moral compasses don't work when under capitalism we are raised to see other people, especially marginalized groups, simply as numbers, simply as a means to an end, or part of the bottom line. To reconcile morality under late-stage capitalism and hyper-individuality under a guilty versus innocent framework will never work because those in power, the sharks who played the game and won, will never feel guilty. Unlike shame, which seemingly runs deeper than guilt. For example, Top from Big Bang in South Korea, a shame society society, was ostracized and shamed for smoking weed in 2017. Since 2017, Choi Sung-hyun, aka Top, the former lead rapper of K-pop kings Big Bang, had been persona non grata in the Korean entertainment scene, forced into the margins after being charged with smoking marijuana in his home. He was sentenced to 10 months in prison, suspended for 2 years, and had his every move scrutinized and captured by paparazzi camera flashes. Then I ended up disappointing so many people, and at that time, I had to go through an intense darkness, Top revealed. So dark that it's hard to imagine. There were some moments back when I felt such intense and heavy shame that I just wanted to quit everything. Shame clearly does work as intended, but what people are shamed for should be well outlined. Someone smoking weed in their house shouldn't be shamed or jailed, at least in my opinion, but that was what was agreed upon in South Korea by law and by the larger entertainment industry. Agreeing on what is moral and what is immoral is another discussion entirely, as what constitutes morality is very subjective to each culture and each individual. In the US, what is considered moral under white Christian nationalism is vastly different from what is considered moral in more leftist and progressive spaces. And to make things even more complicated, the right is fine in publicly shaming the Democrats and liberals, but not the other way around because we don't want to stoop to their level. Democrats honed in on Trump's guilty sentence as a way to swing voters during the last election and uphold moral superiority. But how well did that stick considering he doesn't care? And in some regards, I'm wary about praising one tactic over another because when public shamings and executions have happened in the US, it has mostly been in service of white supremacy, like public lynchings of black boys and men. Historically in the US, shamings have been used to uphold a culture of fear and racial segregation because it has been mainly used as a tactic by conservative politicians to again uphold white supremacy. Whereas guilt is the liberal alternative to give people time and space to grow and make reparations, and as a metric to again uphold moral superiority because they're guilty, therefore we're innocent, we're the good guys, we have the moral high ground, even though we were able to more quickly mobilize against Jimmy Kimmel's cancellation than a genocide.
As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world.
And when progressives do use shaming against the right, like publicly shaming male sexual abusers during the Me Too movement, they're seen as petty liars who are in turn sued for defamation. So even when the left uses the right's playbook against them, the conservatives are still able to twist the narrative and make themselves out as the victims. More recently, this happened with the Charlie Kirk assassination, where both sides of the political spectrum came together to mourn someone who spewed hate speech and made millions doing it. The Democrats never failed to rally and empathize with the right when the right would never do the same for them. For example, when Melissa and Mark Hortman, Democratic politicians from Minnesota, were murdered in their homes, flags weren't lowered, sports games weren't stopped, in memoriams by the White House were not held. So would publicly shaming politicians on the right, and also moderate Democrats, work as a progressive tactic when it just blows up in our face? I'm wary to think so, unfortunately, for a group of people so self-absorbed, and when it's been thrown back in liberal faces so many times in the past. Not to mention the right controls the largest military on the planet, and moderates ran on a campaign talking about having the most lethal fighting force in the world. It's hard to shame people who control an arsenal of guns. But is it worth trying despite the possible corrosive overreach that Taiwo wrote about? Perhaps. Maybe it won't dissuade people at the top 0.1%, who are so removed from society at large that they have no idea how much food costs, but shaming people who platform hate speech, who say and do provocative things either online or in real life just to stir things up and get clicks, like touting conspiracy theories, or even shaming people or going no contact with people you know in your own life who hold and express bigoted beliefs, that could maybe dissuade them from voicing them out loud at least, through people just not engaging with them anymore. Maybe it might help silence them. Though I will say in my own life, going no contact with people who are racist bigots doesn't really stop them from holding those beliefs, unfortunately. It's really hard to change people, but maybe we can change the culture. Taiwo opens his article with an anecdote about how in 1962, eminent philosopher Bertrand Russell received a series of letters from Sir Oswald Mosley, the founder of the British Union of Fascists, inviting him to a debate. Russell not only declined the invitation, but replied quite generally that nothing fruitful or sincere could ever emerge from association between us, since every ounce of my energy has been devoted to an active opposition to cruel bigotry, compulsive violence, and the sadistic persecution which has characterized the philosophy and practice of fascism. By simply not engaging with bigots and shaming them for their beliefs, perhaps even making them embarrassed, we could create new norms, where hate is not tolerated, respected, or legitimized, in the open at least. Maybe we should at least try. To paraphrase the article, shame is the bare minimum. I think a lot of people online, at least, are vocal about bringing back public shaming and have even turned it into a meme because of how polarized things are on the internet and in real life, where people just start grifting for money, and where it's right there for us to see on our phones how so many people who are guilty are able to just go through life without facing any ramifications for their guilt, specifically white wealthy celebrities and politicians, and where we can see so many innocent people and the planet die in front of us at the hands of these white wealthy politicians and billionaires. Class inequality has never been so visible. We need to start shaming people again. And I think maybe perhaps in the US, not having public shaming is done by design. Not only because shame culture is viewed as backwards in the US as it's associated with non-white, i.e. non-civilized people, but because it's generally very uncomfortable to feel shame. And who wants to feel that? To have this internal and external shame that you're not living up to your best self or not being virtuous leads people to dark places. But with guilt, you can find some way to fix that negative feeling through apologizing, proving your innocence, doing better, etc. Surrounding yourself with yes men. Guilt is somewhat easier to overcome, especially in the US where guilty people are made famous and popular and even voted into office. Again, perhaps this is by design because it lets people with power off the hook more easily, under the guise of a more civilized society. But as I quoted in the beginning, since the US has no conscience, how could we ever really even begin to feel guilt? Enter shaming. However, I remain somewhat, again, wary of bringing back public shaming under techno-fascism due to the panopticon of social media where marginalized people are more likely to be shamed and be recorded in their most vulnerable moments for clicks and views. Sarah Z already made a video about this that I'll put here. On the other hand, it is through this technology that we can possibly start shaming ICE officers, for example, even though their faces are hidden. Perhaps we can use the tech the same way actual fascists do, by trying to shame them on large social media platforms. But also, isn't that what they want? And not only that, but even when one of them is murdered, they're then martyred. How is public online shaming a viable way to fight fascism when reposting and sharing images of state-sanctioned violence also helps uphold a culture of fear? Foucault wrote in Discipline and Punish that the aim of public punishment was to make an example, not only by making people aware that the slightest offense was likely to be punished, but by arousing feelings of terror by the spectacle of power letting its anger fall upon the guilty person. In criminal matters, the most difficult point is the imposition of the penalty. It is the aim and the end of the procedure, and its only fruit by example and terror, when it is well applied to the guilty person. When public shaming and punishment was first introduced, it was to uphold the status quo and satiate the masses, while also striking fear into them. But the progressive left want to use this tactic to try to shame those in power and turn the whole thing on its head. And I think in general it's a noble idea because that is, again, the bare minimum we can do as civilians is to shame those who uphold authoritarianism. Will bringing back public shaming work on social media? I don't know. I did see recently that an ICE officer was relieved of his duties after shoving a woman to the ground in a public immigration court hearing, so perhaps there's hope, but it will take a real cultural shift and a political leftist shift in the Democratic Party to change things. I will say that dollars speak louder than words. The Starbucks boycott and the canceling of Disney Plus subscriptions did create a noticeable dent in these companies' bottom lines that they changed back some policies, at least with Disney Plus, and eventually caved to putting Jimmy Kimmel back on the air. Dollars and cents speak louder than guilt or shame in a capitalistic society, so maybe that's the most effective way, right now at least, that we as the masses can bring change about at the top. As Stokely Charmichael said, boycotts are the most passive thing we as people can do to make change, and it's worth doing.
So Dr. King and his associates got together and said, "This is inhuman. We will boycott your bus system." Now understand what a boycott is. A boycott is a passive act. It is the most passive political act that anyone can commit, a boycott. Because what the boycott was doing was simply saying, we will not ride your buses. No sort of antagonism. He was not even verbally violent. He was peaceful. Dr. King's policy was that nonviolence would achieve the gains for black people in the United States. His major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and will be moved to change his heart. That's very good. He only made one fallacious assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. The United States has none.
When I told my friend about this video topic, they asked me, is canceling guilting or shaming? And in my eyes, at least, canceling is based on being found guilty of something and then the public shaming them for it. But if the accused doesn't feel guilty, what's there to be ashamed of? How can you possibly shame someone who feels no guilt or shame? Do you then have to use fear? Fear of being ostracized or embarrassed or excommunicated, fear of some sort of punishment in order to have real consequences. For example, we can have free speech, but not free of consequences. Sure, you can say something hateful and horrible, but that doesn't mean you can get away with it scot-free. I guess what I'm wondering here is that on the guilt, shame, fear spectrum, what would most likely lead to more progressive norms when it comes to delegitimizing hateful movements? Or would you just have to take down capitalism in order to not create incentives to stratify and segregate people in the first place? Take down the system that leads to hoarding wealth and power and that upholds social strata? These questions are not ones I have answers for personally, but I think they're worth exploring. So that's it for this one. I hope you liked it. These questions have been on my mind recently, and maybe you could leave your answers down below in the comments, or at least your thoughts. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.